Millionaire recognizes his old-school friend, working as a waitress. What follows will break him. The clinking of silverware against porcelain was the only sound Damien Hawthorne permitted to break the monastic silence of his negotiations. He sat at the corner table of Le Ciel, a restaurant so exclusive it didn't have a sign, only a reputation whispered among the city's elite. The air was thick with the scent of truffle oil and old money. Across from him, a man named Gregory Mercer was sweating, his bespoke suit suddenly looking like a straitjacket. Damien hadn't raised his voice. He never did. His power was a low-frequency hum, a pressure that settled in the chest and made it hard to breathe. He was dismantling Mercer's company, a tech startup that had the misfortune of creating something Damien wanted, and he was doing it with the detached precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. "The valuation is non-negotiable, Gregory," Damien said, his voice smooth as polished granite. He swirled the deep crimson wine in his glass, watching the legs cling to the crystal. "Your board has already accepted the preliminary offer. This is a courtesy, a chance for you to walk away with a semblance of dignity." A young waiter, trembling slightly, approached to refill their water glasses. His hand shook, and a single drop of iced water splashed onto the polished mahogany of the table. Damien's eyes, the color of a winter sky, flicked to the spot. He didn't look at the waiter. He didn't have to. The boy froze, his face paling. "Clean that up," Damien said, his voice dropping half an octave. It wasn't a request. It was a verdict. The waiter fumbled for a cloth, his apologies tumbling out in a mortified whisper. Damien had already dismissed him, turning his cold attention back to Mercer. It was in that moment, as his gaze swept across the dining room, a predator surveying his territory, that he saw her. She was clearing a nearby table, her movements efficient and weary. Her uniform, a simple black dress with a crisp white apron, was immaculate but couldn't hide the exhaustion etched in the lines of her face. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun, but a few stray strands had escaped, clinging to her temple. She turned, her profile illuminated by the soft glow of a wall sconce, and a jolt, sharp and unwelcome, shot through Damien. He knew that profile. He knew the determined set of her jaw, the slight curve of her nose. It was Clara Vance. The name echoed in the vast, empty chambers of his memory, a ghost from a life he had long since buried. They had been in the same high school, 2 decades and $1 billion ago. He remembered her not as a waitress, but as a girl with paint on her fingers and ink stains on her jeans. A girl who argued with teachers and read poetry during lunch. A girl who had once looked at him not with fear or awe, but with a spark of something he hadn't understood then and couldn't name now. Seeing her here, in his world but so utterly outside of it, was a dissonance that grated on his carefully ordered universe. She was a glitch in the matrix of his success, and in that first raw moment of recognition, a feeling he hadn't anticipated surfaced. Not pity, but a cold, possessive curiosity. The memory was sharp, a shard of glass in his mind. Senior year, a dusty art classroom smelling of turpentine and clay. Damien, then a lanky, ambitious teenager already mapping out his path to Wall Street, was there only because it was a required credit. Clara was at the potter's wheel, her hands covered in wet clay, her brow furrowed in concentration. He'd made a cynical comment about the pointlessness of art in a world run by numbers. She had stopped the wheel, fixed him with her intense, dark eyes, and said, "Some people build things with their hands, Damien, not just tear them down with contracts." The insult had stung precisely because it had been true. He was already proud of his detached, analytical mind. He saw systems, loopholes, and leverage where others saw sentiment. Clara saw stories, colors, and textures. They were from different species. Now, that same woman was stacking plates. Her hands, which once shaped clay, now clearing away the remnants of other people's indulgence. He watched as she approached a table of laughing stockbrokers, their voices loud and abrasive. One of them, a man with a slick, predatory grin, reached out and casually touched her arm as she refilled his glass. "Another bottle of the 82 Margaux, sweetheart, and bring a smile with it this time." Clara didn't flinch. She simply retracted her arm, her expression unreadable. "Of course, sir," she said, her voice a low, steady murmur that gave nothing away. Damien felt a strange and volatile mixture of anger and something else, something proprietary. The stockbroker's casual disrespect offended him, not on a human level, but as if the man had just scuffed one of his expensive shoes. Clara Vance was a piece of his past, a person from his story. Her current station was an untidy loose end, and seeing her treated as a piece of furniture by a lesser predator ignited a chillingly calculated impulse within him. He concluded his business with Mercer in a clipped, brutal fashion, leaving the man pale and shattered. Then he beckoned the maître d'. "The waitress," Damien said, his gaze fixed on Clara. "The one at table 7. What's her name?" "That is Clara, monsieur," the maître d' replied, bowing slightly. "I want to speak with her, in private." A few minutes later, Clara was shown into a small, private tasting room at the back of the restaurant. She stood before him, her hands clasped behind her back, her posture straight. The weariness was still there, but up close, Damien could see the fierce intelligence in her eyes. It was guarded, wary, but undimmed. "You wanted to see me, sir?" she asked. The word "sir" was a perfectly polished stone of formality, creating a chasm between them. He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You don't recognize me, do you?" She looked at him then. Truly looked, and a flicker of something crossed her face, a shadow of a memory. "Damien? Damien Hawthorne?" "The one and only," he said with a thin, humorless smile. "It's been a while, Clara." "Yes," she said, her voice flat. "It has." There was no warmth, no surprise, no delight, just a statement of fact. "I was surprised to see you," he began, letting the implication hang in the air. "Surprised to see you like this. People's lives take different paths," she said, her chin lifting a fraction of an inch. It was a dismissal, a quiet drawing of a boundary he had no intention of respecting. His initial plan had been a vague impulse, but seeing her quiet dignity, her refusal to be cowed, solidified it into a concrete objective. He would not just help her, he would absorb her. He would pluck her from this life and place her in his, and in doing so, he would prove the ultimate truth he lived by, that everything and everyone had a price. "I have a proposition for you," Damien said, leaning forward, the predator closing in. "I need a new personal assistant. The hours are long, the work is demanding, but the pay is considerable, enough to ensure you never have to work in a place like this again." Clara's eyes narrowed slightly. She wasn't looking at him with gratitude. She was looking at him with suspicion. Why? It was the one question he hadn't expected. People didn't ask him why. They asked how much. "Why not?" he countered smoothly. "We have a shared history, a little nostalgia, perhaps. Let's just say I believe in taking care of old friends." The lie was so bald, so transparent in its arrogance, that he expected her to see right through it. But he also saw the flicker of calculation in her eyes, the subtle clenching of her jaw. He knew, with the certainty of a man who understood pressure points, that she needed the money. He had all the power, and power, he knew, was the most persuasive argument of all. Clara's apartment was a third-floor walk-up, in a neighborhood that the city's relentless gentrification had forgotten. It was small, meticulously clean, and filled with a warmth that was alien to Damien's sterile penthouse. Books were crammed into every available space, spilling from shelves and stacked on end tables. A half-finished painting, a swirl of deep blues and fiery oranges, rested on an easel in the corner. The air smelled of lavender and old paper. Her son, Leo, was 7 years old. He was a small, quiet boy with his mother's dark, observant eyes. He sat at the kitchen table, sketching in a notepad, a stack of medical pamphlets peeking out from under a pile of mail. It was a detail Clara tried to hide, but Damien, whose entire career was built on seeing what people tried to conceal, noticed it instantly. It was a vulnerability, a lever. She had accepted his offer. He knew she would. The salary he'd named was obscene, a figure designed to obliterate any hesitation. But accepting was one thing. Her compliance was another. "Your duties will be comprehensive," he'd told her on her first day, standing in the center of his cavernous living room. The room was a monument to wealth, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a godlike view of the city, minimalist furniture that cost more than her apartment building, and not a single personal photograph. "You will manage my schedule, my travel, my household staff. You will be available 24 hours a day. You will be an extension of my will. Is that clear?" "Perfectly," she'd replied, her voice even. He quickly learned that her submission was a mirage. He gave her tasks designed to demean, to remind her of her station. He had her sort his collection of antique maps by cartographer and date of publication, a task that took 3 days of painstaking, tedious work. He expected complaints, sighs, some sign of breaking. Instead, she completed the task with quiet efficiency, leaving a neatly typed summary of her organizational system on his desk. She had even identified 2 maps that were likely forgeries, citing minute inconsistencies in the paper's watermarks. She was resisting him, but not in a way he could punish. It was a subtle, infuriating campaign of quiet competence. She was a fortress of dignity, and he found himself laying siege to it with escalating perversity. He decided she needed a new wardrobe. "You represent me now," he announced one afternoon, handing her a black credit card with an unlimited spending limit. "You can't do that dressed in that." He gestured vaguely at her simple, practical attire. He expected her to be thrilled, or at least intimidated. He imagined her returning with bags from Chanel and Prada, a woman remade in his image. Instead, she returned with a handful of beautifully tailored, yet understatedly modest, black and gray suits. They were expensive, yes, but they were armor, not decoration. And she continued to wear her own watch, a simple, worn leather-strapped timepiece that looked ancient next to the designer fabrics. It was a small act of defiance, a reminder that a part of her remained untouched by his money. The watch annoyed him more than any overt act of rebellion could have. "That thing is an eyesore," he snapped one day, gesturing at her wrist. "Buy a Patek Philippe, my treat." She looked down at the watch, a soft, unreadable expression on her face. "It was my father's," she said simply. "It keeps perfect time." She was supposed to be a project, an object he could mold, but the material was proving far more resilient than he'd anticipated. He felt a frustrating, unfamiliar emotion. He was losing control. He was used to people who were either sycophants or enemies. Clara was neither. She was an employee who did her job perfectly while silently refusing to surrender her soul. The more he tried to force her into the box he'd created, the more she exposed the emptiness of the box itself. Her quiet dignity was a mirror, and in it he began to see a distorted, ugly reflection of himself. The annual Foundation for Urban Progress Gala was the pinnacle of the city's social calendar, a self-congratulatory spectacle where millions of dollars were pledged to abstract causes by people who wouldn't dare set foot in the neighborhoods they claimed to be saving. For Damien, it was a necessary performance. It was about solidifying his status, networking with power brokers, and being seen. This year, he decided, Clara would be his date. It was the ultimate test of his project. He would display her, his creation, his salvaged artifact. He would show the world how his influence could transform a worn-out waitress into a woman of elegance and poise. "You will accompany me to the FOP Gala on Saturday," he informed her, not asked her, a week before the event. "A stylist will be here tomorrow morning. A gown has been selected." "A gown?" she repeated, her voice betraying a hint of skepticism for the first time. "Damien, I'm your assistant. I can manage the arrangements from the office." "You are misinterpreting your function," he said coldly. "You will be at my side." The gown was a sliver of midnight blue silk that clung to every curve. It was breathtakingly beautiful and ruthlessly revealing. The stylist, a man with a flamboyant accent and mercilessly critical eyes, fussed over her, pinning her hair into an elaborate chignon and applying makeup with the focus of a Renaissance painter. When he was finished, the woman in the mirror was a stranger to Clara. She was stunning, but she was a sculpture, cold and perfect. All traces of the woman who read poetry and painted with abandon had been polished away. Damien's reaction was a quiet, satisfied nod. "Acceptable," he pronounced, as if evaluating a stock portfolio. The ballroom was a galaxy of glittering diamonds and forced smiles. Damien moved through the crowd with the effortless grace of a shark, Clara a silent shadow in his wake. He introduced her simply as "my associate, Clara," a deliberately ambiguous title that invited speculation. He saw the looks she received, the appraising glances from the men, the sharp, envious glares from their wives. He felt a surge of possessive pride. He had done this. He had made this. But as the night wore on, his satisfaction began to curdle. Clara was a perfect automaton. She smiled when it was appropriate, nodded at the inane chatter of billionaires' wives, and held her champagne flute with practiced elegance. But her eyes were distant, her spirit absent. She was there, but she wasn't. He cornered her by a marble column, irritated by her passive resistance. "You could at least pretend to be enjoying yourself." "I'm pretending as hard as I can," she replied, her voice so low only he could hear it. "Isn't this what you're paying me for? To be an acceptable accessory?" The word accessory hit him like a slap. Was that all this was? A petty exercise in power? He looked around the room, at the glittering, soulless faces, at the vacuous conversations about art auctions and yacht maintenance. For the first time, he felt a profound sense of emptiness, a sudden, jarring awareness of the hollowness at the center of his world. These people weren't his friends. They were assets, contacts, rivals. The entire evening was a transaction, just like his relationship with Clara. Later, a celebrated philanthropist, a man in his 70s named Theodore Sterling, took the stage to announce a new literacy initiative. He spoke with genuine passion about the power of books, about how a single story could change a child's life. Damien scoffed internally. It was sentimental drivel, designed to pry open wallets. He glanced at Clara. To his astonishment, she was listening with rapt attention. Her mask of cool indifference had slipped. Her eyes were bright, her posture alert. When Sterling finished his speech, the room erupted in polite, obligatory applause. But Clara's applause was different. It was genuine. And for the first time that night, a real, unforced smile touched her lips. It was a small, fleeting thing, but it was radiant. It was like watching a statue come to life. And in that moment, Damien understood. He hadn't transformed her at all. He had merely put a costume on her. The real Clara, the girl who loved books and art, was still there, hidden beneath the silk and diamonds. Her smile wasn't for him, or for this world. It was for the ghost of an idea, a principle she still believed in, a world he had long ago dismissed as unprofitable. The realization didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a profound and unsettling defeat. The gala marked a turning point. Damien's frustration with Clara curdled into a quiet obsession. Her resilience was no longer just a challenge, it was an enigma he had to solve. Why was she so impervious to the things that motivated everyone else in his world? Why did his money, which could bend markets and topple corporations, glance off her spirit like water off stone? He began to watch her more closely. He noticed the small things. The way she would pause by the single, sad-looking ficus tree in his lobby, gently wiping dust from its leaves. The way her face softened when she spoke to Leo on the phone, her voice dropping to a tender murmur that was a world away from the cool professionalism she showed him. He saw the books she read during her lunch break. Not bestsellers or business manuals, but worn paperbacks of classic novels and poetry collections. He decided that to understand her, he needed to understand her past. Not the shared high school memories, but the years in between. The years that had led her to that restaurant. It was a gross invasion of privacy, but the concept of privacy was, to Damien, a quaint notion for those with things to hide. Information was power. He hired a private investigator, the best in the city, a discreet man named Fletcher who specialized in digging up the buried secrets of the wealthy. "I want to know everything about Clara Vance," Damien instructed him, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Her employment history, her financial records, her family, everything since she was 18. "A background check on your own assistant, Mr. Hawthorne?" Fletcher asked, raising a single, professionally neutral eyebrow. "Just do it," Damien snapped. While he waited for the report, his behavior towards Clara grew more erratic. One moment he was cold and demanding, the next he was asking strangely personal questions. "Your father," he said one afternoon, feigning casual interest. "What did he do?" Clara looked up from her computer, her fingers freezing over the keyboard. "He was a publisher," she said, her voice guarded. "A publisher? Like Random House?" A faint, sad smile touched her lips. "No, nothing like that. He ran a small independent press, Vance & Sons. The name meant nothing to him." "Did he do well?" The smile vanished. He did what he loved. He published beautiful books that no one else would. First editions of poetry, art monographs, forgotten classics. He cared more about the quality of the paper than the profit margin. She looked away, her gaze distant. It wasn't a world built to last. The words hung in the air, filled with a weight he couldn't quite decipher. He felt like he was fumbling in the dark, touching the edges of a story he couldn't see. Fletcher's report arrived a week later in a sealed manila envelope. Damien waited until late at night, after the city had quieted, and the only sound was the hum of the air filtration system in his penthouse. He poured himself a glass of scotch, the amber liquid catching the light, and opened the folder. Oh, it was all there, laid out in cold, hard type. A timeline of a life derailed. Clara had gone to college, studying art history and literature. She'd graduated with honors. She had started working with her father at the small press, learning the trade, her name appearing as an associate editor on several publications. The report contained scanned images of the book covers. They were exquisite, works of art in themselves. Then, the timeline fractured. 9 years ago, Vance & Sons Press, after struggling for years against the tide of corporate publishing, had been the subject of a hostile takeover. It had been acquired by a larger media conglomerate, which in turn was owned by a private equity firm. The firm's strategy was outlined in brutal, emotionless terms: asset liquidation. The press was dismantled. Its assets, printing equipment, distribution rights, and a vast back catalog of unique books were sold off piecemeal. The employees were all terminated. The name of the private equity firm that had orchestrated the takeover leaped off the page, hitting Damien with the force of a physical blow. Hawthorne Capital. His firm, the world tilted on its axis. The air in the penthouse suddenly felt thin, suffocating. Damien stood up, his heart hammering against his ribs, and walked to the window. The city sprawled below him, a glittering tapestry of lights, a kingdom he had conquered. But he wasn't seeing it. He was seeing a name on a piece of paper. Vance and Sons. He didn't remember it. Of course he didn't. It was one of dozens of small-scale acquisitions from that era, a minor footnote in his relentless climb. His firm had a standard playbook for what they called underperforming legacy assets. They would buy the company, strip it of anything valuable, and discard the husk. It was efficient. It was profitable. It was utterly devoid of humanity. He strode to his office, his hands shaking, and pulled up the archived files for the Vance and Sons acquisition. There it was, in black and white. Project Nightingale, they had called it. A valuation of the company's tangible assets, antique printing presses, a warehouse full of rare paper stock, real estate. The intellectual property, the books themselves, had been deemed non-viable and sold in a bulk lot for pennies on the dollar to a remainder company. The personnel files were there too, a list of names. And at the top, Thomas Vance, founder and CEO. Terminated. A few lines below, Clara Vance, associate editor. Terminated. The Scotch glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the marble floor. He barely heard it. He was the architect of her ruin. Every piece of the puzzle slammed into place with sickening clarity. Her father, his life's work erased, his spirit broken. The report detailed his subsequent decline in health, the mounting medical bills, his death 2 years later from a heart attack. Clara, left with the debt and a young son to care for, forced to take any job she could find. Barista, office temp, waitress. The years of struggle, the exhaustion he saw in her eyes, the quiet, desperate dignity. He had caused it all. His proposition, his act of arrogant, possessive charity, was not a rescue. It was a grotesque insult, a final twist of the knife he had plunged into her family's heart 9 years ago. He had brought her into his home, a living trophy of a victory he hadn't even remembered winning. He had criticized her clothes, her watch, her very being, all while being the nameless, faceless force that had shattered her world. The cruelty of it, the sheer cosmic irony, was staggering. He felt a wave of nausea. The self-image he had so carefully constructed, the master of the universe, the clear-eyed pragmatist, crumbled into dust. He wasn't a master. He was a vandal. He hadn't built an empire. He had ransacked other people's lives and called the plunder progress. He thought of her smile at the gala, that brief, radiant flash of her true self, ignited by the talk of books and stories. He had destroyed the very world that had made that smile possible. He remembered her words in the art room all those years ago. Some people build things with their hands, Damien, not just tear them down with contracts. She had seen him then for exactly what he was and what he would become. He sank into his chair, the shards of glass crunching under his shoe, and buried his face in his hands. The silence of the penthouse was no longer peaceful. It was accusatory. It was the silence of a tomb he had built for himself, decorated with the spoils of forgotten lives. And in that crushing silence, Damien Hawthorne, the man who had everything, realized he had nothing at all. For 2 days, Damien was a ghost in his own home. He canceled meetings. He ignored calls. He barely spoke to his household staff. He existed on scotch and self-loathing, pacing the cold floors of his penthouse like a caged animal. The Fletcher report lay on his desk, a toxic testament to his own oblivion. Clara moved around him with quiet caution. She managed the fallout from his absence with her usual unnerving competence, rescheduling appointments and placating irate business partners. She must have sensed the shift in him, the dark, volatile energy that now radiated from him, but she said nothing. She simply did her job, an island of calm in his self-inflicted storm. Her composure was the most damning indictment of all. She had no idea that she was living in the house of the man who had destroyed her father. She treated him with a professional courtesy that felt like a hot coal against his skin. He knew he had to tell her. The lie of their situation was too monstrous to sustain. But how? How could he possibly articulate the scale of his transgression? "I'm sorry," was a pathetic, meaningless phrase, an insult to the depth of the wound he had inflicted. He finally summoned her to his office on the third night. The city lights glittered outside, indifferent and beautiful. He hadn't bothered to have the broken glass from the Scotch tumbler cleaned up. The shards still lay scattered on the marble, catching the light like fallen stars. Clara entered, her notebook in hand, her face a mask of professional neutrality. "You wanted to see me, Damien?" He gestured to the chair opposite his desk. He couldn't look at her. He stared at the damning report, his hands clenched into fists on the polished wood. "I know what happened," he began, his voice raspy, unfamiliar to his own ears. "I'm not sure I understand," she said, her tone cautious. "To your father. To his press." He finally forced himself to meet her gaze. Her eyes, which had been calm and unreadable, suddenly sharpened with a painful, guarded light. Vance & Sons. The name, spoken by him in this room, felt like a desecration. Clara went very still. Her knuckles, resting on her notebook, were white. "What about it?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "I've been looking into it," he said, the words clumsy and inadequate. "The acquisition, the liquidation." He took a breath, the air burning his lungs. "The firm that bought it, that took it apart, was Hawthorne Capital." He watched her face as the words registered. It was like watching a beautiful, intricate sculpture crack from the inside out. The professional mask disintegrated, replaced by a wave of raw, unfiltered shock. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin ashen. It wasn't just shock. It was a dawning horror, a slow, sickening realization that rearranged her entire reality. "You," she whispered, the word barely audible. It was a sound of profound betrayal. "It was you?" He could only nod, the movement stiff and painful. She stared at him, and in her eyes, he saw the last 9 years of her life replaying in a horrifying new context. The loss of her father's dream, his subsequent death, her struggle to raise Leo, the humiliation of taking charity from a stranger. It all now led back to him. The man who had presented himself as her savior was, in fact, the source of her deepest pain. "My job," she said, her voice trembling with a nascent, rising fury. "This entire thing, you taking me from the restaurant? What was this? A victory lap? Did you want to see what had become of the people you crushed underfoot?" "No," he said, his voice cracking. "No, Clara, I swear, I didn't know, I didn't remember." The admission, meant to be a plea for understanding, landed as the ultimate insult. "You didn't remember?" She laughed, a broken, hollow sound that was more terrible than any scream. "You destroyed my father's life. You erased his legacy, everything he built, everything he was, and you didn't even remember? It was just another Tuesday for you, wasn't it? Another line item on a spreadsheet." She stood up, her body trembling. He poured his soul into those books. Every cover, every font, every choice of paper. It was an act of love. He believed that beauty mattered, and you and your firm, you strip-mined it. You sold his antique press for scrap metal and turned his library into pulp. And you forgot. He had no defense. She was right. He had forgotten. It was a rounding error in his vast fortune. He finally stood as well, wanting to reach out, to say something, anything, that could bridge the chasm that had just opened between them. He thought of offering money, a vast sum, enough to set her up for life. But he saw the look in her eyes, and knew it would be the most profound insult he could possibly offer. His money was the weapon that had caused the wound. It could never be the balm that healed it. "Clara, Don't," she cut him off, her voice like ice. "Don't say you're sorry. Don't say anything. There are no words you can say that would mean anything to me." She looked at him one last time, her gaze sweeping over him, his expensive suit, his opulent office. "I quit." She turned and walked out of the room, her back straight, her head held high. The only sound left was the whisper of her footsteps fading down the hall, and the faint, mocking glitter of the broken glass on the floor. Clara's absence left a silence in the penthouse that was heavier and more profound than any before. It wasn't just the lack of her quiet, efficient presence. It was the vacuum left by the truth. Damien was alone with his culpability, the ghost of Thomas Vance now a permanent resident in the sterile, artless rooms of his home. For a week, he did nothing. He was paralyzed by the magnitude of what he had done and the utter inadequacy of any potential response. The impulse to write a check, his default solution to any problem, felt vulgar and obscene. Money was the language he spoke, but it was a dead language in this new, desolate country of his conscience. He needed to understand. Not just the transaction, the cold data of Project Nightingale, but the essence of what he had destroyed. He needed to understand Vance and Sons. His journey of atonement began not with a grand gesture, but with a quiet, desperate search. He tasked Fletcher, the private investigator, with a new, strange mission. "Find them," Damien commanded, his voice raw. "Find every book ever published by Vance and Sons Press. I don't care what it costs, I don't care where they are, find them." It was an archaeological dig into a past he had personally buried. Fletcher's team scoured rare book dealers, online auction sites, dusty library archives, and private collections. Slowly, like artifacts being unearthed, the books began to arrive at the penthouse. They came one by one at first, then in small, carefully packed boxes. A slim volume of poetry by an unknown writer. Its cover a simple, elegant letterpress design. A heavy monograph on Renaissance architecture, filled with stunning, sepia-toned photographs. A beautifully illustrated children's story about a star who was afraid of the dark. Damien handled each one with a reverence he had never before afforded any object. He ran his fingers over the thick, textured paper. He admired the craftsmanship of the bindings, the clarity of the type. He began to read them. He stayed up all night, every night, surrounded by the ghosts of Thomas Vance's dreams. He read the poetry that was too subtle for the mainstream, the histories that were too niche, the art books that were too expensive to produce. He wasn't just reading books, he was reading a man's soul. He saw in them a fierce, uncompromising love for beauty, for story, for the preservation of ideas that the world was in a hurry to forget. He saw what Clara had meant. This wasn't a business, it was a testament. In one of the books, a collection of essays on the art of printing, he found the editor's foreword, written by Thomas Vance himself. "In an age of disposability," Thomas had written, "a well-made book is an act of rebellion. It is a declaration that some things are meant to last. It is a vessel for a piece of a human soul, passed from the writer to the reader, a silent conversation across time. We do not make these books to get rich. We make them because we must. We make them in the hope that, long after we are gone, someone will pick one up and feel the weight of it in their hands, and know that they are not alone." Damien put the book down, his vision blurring. He had not just liquidated a company. He had silenced a conversation. He had smashed the vessels. His next step was even more obsessive. He had Fletcher track down the people, the artists who had illustrated the covers, the writers who had been given their first chance by Thomas, the printers who had worked the old presses. He met with them, not as Damien Hawthorne, the corporate raider, but as a quiet, haunted man seeking information. He met a poet, now a university professor, who wept when he spoke of Thomas. He published my first collection when no one else would even read it. He didn't pay me much, but he gave me a voice. He gave me a belief in myself. He met an illustrator, an elderly woman living in a small cottage upstate, who showed him her original drawings for one of the children's books. Thomas always said the drawings were as important as the words. He treated me like a partner, not a hired hand. Each story was another shard of glass in his heart. These weren't employees. They were a family, a small community built around a shared love for their craft. A community he had shattered without a second thought. This was his penance. Not a public apology or a grand donation, but a slow, painful immersion in the world he had annihilated. He was forcing himself to learn, in excruciating detail, the true value of what he had so casually thrown away. It was a quiet, solitary, and agonizing process. And he was doing it all without contacting Clara. This wasn't for her. It couldn't be. It was for him. It was the first step in a long, dark journey to becoming a man who might, one day, be worthy of even thinking about forgiveness. Months passed. The seasons turned outside Damien's panoramic windows, but he barely noticed. His world had shrunk to the collection of Vance and Sons books that now filled an entire room of his penthouse, a library of his shame. The journey into the past had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. The hard, cynical shell he had built around himself had been cracked open, and the man inside was raw, uncertain, and hollowed out by regret. His work at Hawthorne Capital became mechanical. He went to the office, he sat in meetings, but his mind was elsewhere. His partners noticed the change. The old ruthlessness was gone, replaced by a strange, contemplative distance. He started vetoing deals that reminded him of the Vance and Sons acquisitions that targeted small legacy companies for liquidation. "It's a bad play," he'd murmur, offering a vague, unconvincing financial justification. His partners were confused. The Damien Hawthorne they knew never let sentiment interfere with profit. He knew what he had to do next. It was an idea so audacious, so far outside the logical framework of his life, that it terrified him. But it was the only path forward. It was the only act that felt like construction rather than contrition. He would bring Vance and Sons back to life, not as a subsidiary of Hawthorne Capital, not as a vanity project with his name stamped on it, but as what it was meant to be, a small, fiercely independent press dedicated to beauty and craftsmanship. He began to move his pieces across the board, but with a new purpose. He used his immense resources not to acquire and dismantle, but to restore. He anonymously bought a small, historic building in a quiet, bookish part of the city. He had Fletcher track down the antique printing press that had been sold for scrap. It was rusting in a junkyard in Ohio. Damien paid a small fortune to have it purchased, transported back, and meticulously restored by a team of aging experts. He formed a new company, a foundation, and endowed it with enough capital to run for a century without ever needing to turn a profit. He called it the Nightingale Press, a private, bitter nod to his firm's callous project code. Then came the hardest part. He assembled a board of directors. He chose the poet whose first collection Thomas had published. He chose the elderly illustrator from the cottage upstate. He chose a respected literary historian from the local university. He met with each of them, explaining that an anonymous benefactor wanted to create a press that honored the legacy of Thomas Vance. He gave them total creative control. His only stipulation was that the press's mission statement be the exact words from Thomas's foreword. His name was nowhere on the official documents. He was a ghost, a benefactor in the shadows. He was using his power not to control, but to empower, not to own, but to give back. It was the most difficult and the most meaningful work of his life. He never contacted Clara. He had no right to. He knew, through Fletcher's discreet, ongoing surveillance, a habit he couldn't quite break, though its purpose had shifted from control to a desperate, distant form of concern, that she had found a job as an administrator at a local community center. She was making less money, but he saw photos of her with Leo in the park, and the haunted, weary look she'd worn in his presence was gone. She looked peaceful. Wounding her with his presence again was a selfish act he was no longer capable of. One autumn afternoon, he stood across the street from the newly christened Nightingale Press. A simple, elegant sign hung above the door. Inside, he could see the warm glow of lights and the shapes of books on shelves. He saw the poet he'd appointed as director laughing with a young writer. He was building something. For the first time in his life, he was building something that created rather than destroyed. It wasn't a solution. It didn't erase the past. The scar on his soul and on her life would always be there. But it was a response. It was an echo of a press, a quiet promise to a ghost that his work had not been in vain. It was a start. And for now, it had to be enough. 2 years passed. 2 years in which Damien Hawthorne became a stranger to the man he had once been. He continued to run Hawthorne Capital, but its focus shifted. He steered the firm towards investments in sustainable technology, medical research, and educational startups. He was still a capitalist, but one with a conscience, a conversion his partners found baffling but undeniably profitable. The Nightingale Press flourished, quietly gaining a reputation for publishing bold, beautiful books, just as Vance & Sons had done. Damien's involvement remained a secret, his only connection the quarterly, anonymous financial reports and the occasional masochistic pleasure of buying one of their new books from a local store. He kept his distance from Clara. He knew she still worked at the community center. He knew Leo was now 9 years old and was a bright, talented artist, just like his mother. He knew these things from Fletcher's reports, which he still received, though they now felt less like surveillance and more like letters from a world he was forbidden to enter. The call came on a Tuesday morning. It wasn't from Fletcher. It was from Dr. Eris Mercer, a leading pediatric neurologist whose research foundation Hawthorne Capital had recently endowed with a significant grant. Dr. Mercer was a different man from his brother Gregory, whom Damien had broken in that restaurant years ago. Aris was a healer, dedicated and brilliant. "Damien, I'm calling about a confidential matter," Dr. Mercer said, his voice urgent. "It concerns one of the conditions we discussed, a very rare degenerative neurological disorder. We have a new case, a young boy." "What can I do to help?" Damien asked immediately. "The boy's mother is a single parent with limited means. The only viable treatment is a new experimental gene therapy we've been developing. It's shown incredible promise in trials, but it's astronomically expensive and not yet covered by any insurance." Dr. Mercer paused. "The boy's name is Leo Vance." Oh, Damien's blood ran cold. The world, which had started to feel solid under his feet, dissolved into a terrifying, roaring vortex. Leo, Clara's son. "His prognosis without the treatment?" Damien asked, his voice a strangled whisper. "A slow, progressive loss of motor function and cognitive ability over the next 5 to 10 years, Dr. Mercer said gently. "With the treatment, we have a very real chance of halting the progression, perhaps even reversing some of the early-stage damage." There was no hesitation, there was no calculation, there was only a single searing thought. This is my fault. He didn't believe in fate or divine retribution, but the crushing weight of this felt like a reckoning. The years of struggle he had forced upon Clara, the financial precarity, the lack of access to the best preventative care. Had it contributed to this? Had a diagnosis been missed or delayed because she was working double shifts as a waitress instead of taking her son to specialists? The thought was a dagger in his soul. "Fund it," Damien said. his voice hard and absolute. Fund the entire treatment. Fund a private room. Fund the best nursing care. Set up an endowment for his lifelong follow-up appointments. I don't want his mother to see a single bill, ever. Damien, this will run into the millions. Do it, Damien commanded. And Eris, it must be anonymous. Completely. The funding is to come from a general hospital grant, a new philanthropic initiative. Under no circumstances is my name, or the name of Hawthorne Capital, to be associated with it. Is that understood? Yes, Dr. Mercer said, a note of awe in his voice. Of course. Thank you, Damien. Damien hung up the phone, his body trembling. This wasn't charity. This wasn't redemption. This was a debt. It was the desperate, frantic act of a man trying to stop a tidal wave of consequence that he had set in motion 9 years ago with the stroke of a pen. He had destroyed her past. He would be damned if he let him destroy her future, too. He went to the room where he kept the Vance & Sons books. He picked up the illustrated children's story, the one about the star who was afraid of the dark. He opened it and saw the dedication, printed in elegant script, "For my own little star. May you never be afraid to shine." He sank to the floor, the small, beautiful book clutched in his hands, and finally, after all these years, Damien Hawthorne wept. The news came to Clara like a miracle, delivered by a kind-faced hospital administrator. Leo's experimental treatment, a dizzying financial impossibility that had been the source of her sleepless nights and gnawing terror, had been fully and anonymously funded. A new grant, the administrator explained, for rare pediatric diseases. It was a 1 in a million chance, a lottery win of impossible grace. Clara was overwhelmed with relief, a feeling so potent it almost brought her to her knees. But beneath the relief, a tiny, persistent seed of suspicion took root. She had spent years navigating the labyrinth of social services and medical bureaucracy. Miracles like this didn't just happen. Anonymity of this scale, in a world that ran on donor recognition and naming rights, was almost unheard of. The seed grew over the next few weeks as Leo began his treatment. The level of care was extraordinary. A private room with a view of the park. A team of dedicated specialists. Every possible comfort was provided for, every bureaucratic hurdle mysteriously cleared before she even encountered it. It was too seamless, too perfect. There was only one person she knew, with the resources and the motive to orchestrate something so vast and so silent. She found him on a rainy Thursday afternoon, standing across the street from the Nightingale Press. She had gone there on a whim, drawn by a review she'd read of a new poetry collection that sounded like something her father would have loved. She'd bought the book, and holding it in her hands, its quality and character so achingly familiar, her suspicion had crystallized into certainty. She saw him then, a solitary figure in a dark coat, his face partially hidden by the collar turned up against the rain. He wasn't looking at the entrance. He was looking at the window, where a display of their new books stood, illuminated against the gray afternoon. He looked older, his face etched with a profound weariness that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with his soul. She crossed the street, her heart pounding a frantic, angry rhythm against her ribs. The rain plastered her hair to her face, but she didn't care. "It was you," she said, her voice cutting through the sound of the downpour. Damien turned, and for a moment he looked utterly lost, as if she were an apparition. His eyes, when they met hers, were filled not with the cold arrogance she remembered, but with a deep, bottomless sorrow. "Clara," he breathed. "Leo's treatment," she pressed, refusing to let him off the hook. "The grant, the anonymous benefactor, it was you, wasn't it?" He didn't try to lie. The time for lies was long past. He simply nodded, his gaze unwavering. Yes, the fury she had anticipated, the rage she had rehearsed in her mind, suddenly felt complicated, muddied by the undisguised pain in his eyes. "Why?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "What is this, Damien? Another power play? Are you trying to buy my forgiveness? Is that the price tag on my son's life?" "No," he said, and his voice was so raw, so utterly devoid of artifice, that it stopped her cold. "Your forgiveness is not something I have the right to ask for. It's not something I could ever earn. This isn't a transaction." He took a step closer, the rain dripping from his face like tears. "When I found out what I had done to your father, to you, I understood that I had broken something. Not just a business, a future, a world in which you wouldn't have had to struggle, a world where Leo might have had access to better care, sooner, where this might never have gotten so bad." He gestured helplessly towards the press behind him. The press, I did that for me, to try and build something instead of only breaking things. But Leo—" His voice choked with emotion. "Leo is different. This is not a gift. It's a debt. The smallest down payment on an unpayable debt. I'm not trying to buy your forgiveness, Clara. I'm just trying to fix one small piece of the world I shattered." She stared at him, the rain running between them like a river. She saw the truth of his words in the stark, unshielded agony on his face. This wasn't the same man who had sat across from her in that restaurant. The power, the arrogance, the cold detachment. It had all been burned away, leaving this haunted, grieving stranger in its place. He wasn't trying to control her. He was trying to atone. The anger in her heart didn't vanish, but something else mingled with it. A complex, painful, and deeply human understanding. He had committed an unforgivable act, but his transformation, his slow-burning penance, was terrifyingly sincere. She didn't know what to say. The words, "thank you," felt like a betrayal of her father. The words, "I hate you," felt like a lie. So she said nothing. She just stood there in the rain, looking at the man who had been her nemesis, her benefactor, and the architect of her deepest sorrow, and felt the foundations of her world shift once more. Leo's treatment was a success. The disease's progression was halted. Slowly, with painstaking therapy, he began to regain some of the strength he had lost. The light returned to his eyes, his laughter once again filling the small apartment that no longer felt shadowed by fear. Clara's life, for the first time in a decade, was not defined by a desperate hand-to-mouth struggle. She had the freedom to simply be a mother. She never spoke to Damien again after that day in the rain. There was no need. Everything that needed to be said had been laid bare between them. But a silent, unspoken line of communication remained. Every month, a single beautifully crafted book from the Nightingale Press would arrive at her doorstep, with no note, no return address. She knew who it was from. It wasn't a plea. It felt like a quiet, ongoing apology, a reminder. One afternoon, a year after their confrontation, she took Leo to the park. He was running, chasing a soccer ball with a slight limp that his therapist said would fade with time. Watching him, her heart filled with a gratitude so fierce it was almost painful. She saw Damien then. He was sitting on a bench on the far side of the park, partially hidden by a large oak tree. He wasn't looking at her. He was watching Leo, a distant, solitary spectator to the joy he had quietly engineered. He wasn't encroaching. He wasn't trying to insert himself into their lives. He was just watching, ensuring the world he had fixed remained intact. He saw her notice him. For a moment, their eyes met across the expanse of green grass. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement of her presence, of her son's health, of the vast and complicated space between them. Then, he stood up and walked away, disappearing into the city. Clara did not forgive him. Forgiveness was too simple a word for the tangled wreckage of their shared history. The ghost of her father, the memory of his broken spirit, would always stand between them. The scar he had left on her life was deep and permanent. But as she watched her son laugh, his face alight with the pure, uncomplicated happiness of childhood, she understood something profound. Redemption is not about being forgiven. It is not a transaction that wipes the slate clean. It is the long, arduous, and often thankless work of becoming a person who deserves to be forgiven. It is about repairing what you have broken, not for praise or absolution, but simply because it must be repaired. Damien Hawthorne had not erased his sin, but he had, at great personal cost, atoned for it. He had used his power not to dominate, but to heal. He had learned the devastating lesson that a life's value cannot be measured on a balance sheet, and that some debts can only be repaid in acts of quiet, selfless restoration. She called Leo over, wrapping him in a fierce hug, breathing in the scent of his hair. She would never forget what Damien had done, but she could accept what he had become. And in that acceptance, there was a kind of peace. Not the easy peace of a happy ending, but the complex, resilient peace of a life that had been shattered, and then, against all odds, been given the chance to grow again, not in spite of the cracks, but around them. The story was over, but the resonance, like the feeling of a well-made book in her hands, would linger for the rest of her life.